At 6 a.m. on July 1, 1916, General Sir Henry Rawlinson cancelled the largest British offensive ever planned and saved 57,000 men who would have died before lunchtime. A thick river fog had risen from the Somme valley overnight, blinding the artillery observers who were supposed to walk the creeping barrage forward across no man's land. Without their eyes on the wire, the gunners could not lift their fire on schedule, and Rawlinson, weighing the prospect of sending Kitchener's volunteers into uncut barbed wire without cover, did the unthinkable. He ordered the men to stand down in their trenches. The Western Front in the summer of 1916 was a static gash from the Channel to the Swiss border. Verdun had been chewing through French divisions since February, and the Chantilly Conference of December 1915 had committed the Allies to a coordinated push along the Somme to relieve the pressure on Pétain's rotating armies. The preliminary bombardment had been hammering the German lines since June 24th, firing roughly 1.5 million shells, many of them duds. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Because what one cancelled order did to the war, and to the century that followed, would not become clear for years. But the moment Rawlinson lowered his field telephone, the entire shape of the conflict began to bend. Word reached London by the following morning, and the political reaction was sharper than the military one. Asquith's cabinet, already strained by the cost of Verdun and the unease over Kitchener's drowning at sea only weeks before, treated the cancellation not as caution, but as collapse of nerve. David Lloyd George, who had taken over as Secretary of State for War in early July, used the moment with the precision of a surgeon. If Rawlinson believed the plan unworkable on the day, then Sir Douglas Haig, who had drafted and championed it, had built an offensive his own subordinates would not execute. Within a fortnight, Haig was recalled to London under the polite fiction of consultations and quietly relieved of command. General Sir Edmund Allenby, until then commanding the Third Army at Arras, was named to the British Expeditionary Force in his place. Allenby arrived in France with orders that no British general had received in nearly 2 years. He was to husband his troops, hold the line, and look east. The era of the Great Western Offensive, for the British at least, was finished before it had truly begun. General Joseph Joffre received the news in a fury that aides remembered for the rest of their lives. The Chantilly Agreement had been the keystone of his year, and now the British were stepping away from it, while his armies bled white at Verdun. In late July, he ordered a French-only push along the Somme, throwing 6 divisions across the Albert Bapaume Road in the hope of forcing a German redeployment. The attack stalled within 3 weeks against intact German wire and unshaken machine gun nests. Verdun continued to consume men at the same dreadful rate. Pétain's rotation of divisions through the meat grinder had been designed on the assumption that British pressure on the Somme would eventually pull German guns north. That assumption was now dead. By autumn, the French army was visibly thinner in its reserves, and quiet warnings began circulating in the Chamber of Deputies that the country could not endure another year like 1916. The cracks that would open in 1917 were already running through the stone. Allenby moved with the speed of a man who had been waiting for permission. By September, divisions were being lifted out of France and shipped through Marseille and Alexandria to reinforce 2 long-neglected theaters, Salonika and Egypt. Sir Archibald Murray, who had been pushing a slow railway and water pipeline across the Sinai since the spring, suddenly found himself with 3 additional infantry divisions and a mounted corps under his command. Murray's columns moved on Gaza in March 1917 with a weight no Ottoman commander on that front had ever faced. The first assault broke the line south of the city, the second swept around it, and by April, the Egyptian Expeditionary Force was past Beersheba and pressing toward Jerusalem. The Arab revolt under Sheriff Hussein, which had risen the previous June, suddenly had an organized British army at its shoulder rather than a distant promise. Enver Pasha, already stretched across the Caucasus and Mesopotamia, found himself defending a theater that was expanding faster than he could reinforce it. Erich von Falkenhayn read the British withdrawal of pressure as the gift it was. By late August, he was transferring fresh divisions east, division after division pulled from quiet sectors of the Western Front and fed into the line opposite Brusilov's advancing Russians in Galicia. The gains the Russian general had paid for in blood through the summer were clawed back through autumn. By November, the line had not only been restored, but pushed past it, and German armies were past Riga and grinding toward Petrograd. Tsar Nicholas II, already presiding over a country whose railways were collapsing and whose bread queues were lengthening, watched the front recede week by week. The Brusilov offensive had been the one bright thread in a year of disasters, and now it was being unwound. The court at Tsarskoye Selo grew quieter. The garrisons in the capital grew louder. What had been postponed by victories at the front could no longer be postponed at all. The reinforcements that had reshaped the Sinai were also reshaping the Balkans. General Sarail, long stuck in a malarial stalemate north of Salonika, now had British divisions under General Milne pushing the line forward through the autumn of 1917. Bulgaria, never enthusiastic about its German alliance and increasingly cut off by the British naval blockade that was strangling all of Central Europe, found its army being pressed back into its own borders. By October, Bulgarian envoys were in Switzerland exploring terms. Sofia did not yet sign, but the willingness to talk was itself a signal that the southern wall of the Central Powers was no longer solid. And then came the moment that would define everything that followed. The Tsar abdicated in March, as he had in our own history, but the provisional government under Kerensky inherited a front that was already broken rather than merely cracking. The summer offensive that bears Kerensky's name in our timeline never gathered the strength to launch. German advances continued, refugees clogged the roads to Moscow, and by September Lenin's faction seized Petrograd in a coup that met almost no resistance from soldiers who had stopped believing in any war at all. In Washington, Woodrow Wilson watched France standing alone on the Western Front and read the cables from Petrograd with growing unease. The American Expeditionary Force buildup, which in our history accelerated through 1917, slowed instead. Wilson would not commit divisions to a continent where the Russian collapse meant German troops were already moving west again, and where the British were visibly disengaging from the main theater. The first American convoys still sailed, but in numbers that would not turn the scales in time. France held through the winter of 1917 and into the spring of 1918 on willpower and conscripted teenagers. When Ludendorff's offensives came in March and April, they fell on a French army no longer reinforced by a growing British host or a flooding American one. Paris held, the line did not. By May, with German cavalry patrols on the Marne and the cabinet evacuating to Bordeaux, the French Republic signed a separate armistice that ceded influence over Belgium and the Iron Basin of Lorraine. Britain made its own peace from a position of strange and selective strength. The Royal Navy still ruled the approaches to Europe, and a British imperial belt now ran from Cairo through Jerusalem to Baghdad and beyond. Germany held continental hegemony from the Rhine to the Volga. The Ottoman Empire was dismembered in the south, intact in Anatolia, and its Arab provinces passed under a British administration that would shape the region for generations. The war did not end with the unconditional collapse of any great power, only with their exhaustion arranged into different shapes. Rawlinson lived to old age in quiet retirement, rarely speaking of the morning the fog came down. He had cancelled an attack. The century did the rest.